Hello, friends. Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast for underrepresented views and life journeys with mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Rats Raj. Today, my guest is a wonderful human who goes by the persona Chubbicorn80 on Twitter. Chubbicorn80 works at the intersection of mental health and Web3. He's been working deeply on himself through talk therapy and a number of trauma therapy practices over the last couple of years. He hopes to go deep into Web3 one day and bring healing practices to this space. Chubbicorn, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to talk to you, Jay.
So I want to start by first I read your bio out, but you're a man of many talents and many hats and things like that. So you've obviously, you've been a strategy consultant. You're now with a startup who's in the COVID tech space. You're in Web3, you've supported NFT projects, you are advocating for psychedelic use, and you yourself have a very, you're part of the Vietnamese diaspora. So instead of me reading a bio, I'm curious, how would you describe your journey so far? In your own terms, whatever you want to start.
Yeah, you started with just, I have a good life. And, for what I found was it's a perception. And I created Chubbicorn80 as a persona because this is a persona that it's my true self. The one that you find, if you find the docs version of me, that's a just made up version, right? It's the old self of me, the one that needed to survive in this world. And in the past 2 years, I've been working on talk therapy, working through trauma, working through what it means to be an adult child of refugees. And as I find my true self, this Chubbicorn is my persona. It is the person I want to be. It's my true self. And I think just part of my journey has been just figuring it out. And for up to about 40 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing. I was born into a world that was just hostile. And now I'm working on healing myself and then working on going beyond just myself and then spreading this word.
So I have to ask, what about Chubbicorn, this persona you built? And, for folks who haven't seen Chubbicorn yet, maybe start with describing what Chubbicorn as a character or persona looks like, feels like. And then why does that resonate with you so strongly?
So first of all, just a visual description, Chubbicorn is a unicorn, and he's fairly chubby. His face is quite, a little pudgy and cute. And I love the imagery because he's got a rainbow hair, right? He's wearing a red hoodie. He's got a little beanie on, just a chill vibe. And the story behind this is Chubbicorn80 is an NFT in the Web3 space. And there's a really cool story behind this is actually I reached out to String, who is the founder of Chubbicorns, and she's Vietnamese as well. I met her on a Discord one day and I said, hey, I want to support you. How can I help you? You're a woman in Web3, right? So you're already a minority in this space and super minority. And I said, I just want to be a good ally and support you. And so she said, come join my Discord, hang out. And eventually I minted Chubbicorn. No idea what I was doing getting into the space. But I think for me, Chubbicorn has a special meaning because it came from just a good intention. I wasn't trying to make a buck. I wasn't trying to make a flip in the NFT space. I simply was trying to help another fellow person. And in return, I got like 100 times back.
That's amazing. So what was that process like? And you said the word Web3. Of course, I know what it is, but I would love for my audience to also understand Web3. Because, one of the interesting things you just said, like, we are, as people of color, are already minorities. But I think there's like some gatekeeping happening where people intentionally use long words and big words to describe NFTs, crypto, Web3. And you and we're going to talk about Hustleverse a little bit because amazing that we're both in the same community. How would you describe it? And what is Web3? And then how did you and your friend sort of fall into that space?
Web3 is kind of to be defined. It's the third iteration of what we call the web, right? So I remember Web 1.0 was when the internet was simply just a simple static web page. We call Web 2 is basically now we created platforms like Facebook where people could just jump on a platform, contribute content. Web 3 is the next iteration of taking away centralized power and distributing it to everyone, and everyone is now an owner, right? So the difference between 2 and 3 is that in 2, a few own all of it, right? So Facebook owns Facebook is the internet essentially, right? So they own control the content. They feed whatever they want to feed to you. Web3 is decentralized. So as an owner, I can own an NFT, which is a token. So think of it as a stock or a share, whatever you want to call it. I own a piece of it and I contribute to this thing that's all owned by us. And so right now, at least there's probably a technical answer, but in my opinion, it's more of a philosophical decision, right? I think as a minority, I really want the power to come back to us, right? We for so long have been just left out of the game. And so Web3 is the opportunity to redistribute things back and make sure that everyone has an equal say, everyone has a piece of this pie.
Hmm. So well said. I think that's what resonates with me, so strongly. I think the part of Web3, which is about shifting the centers of power and having a new sense of like community-driven grassroots sort of form rising up. I mean, it's to be defined. Obviously, I don't think it'll be as easy as people think, but it is an ideological shift, which is amazing. I want you to hold that thought for a second, which is this idea of Web3 decentralization. And I will come back and ask you why this resonates with you as a person of color, as a minority. But let's step back a little bit more. Let's go back a few decades. Tell me about how you grew up, right? And all the things that have happened. You said you're a child of Vietnamese refugees. How did you grow up? And then how did you go back to the understanding of being a child of Vietnamese refugees maybe later on? I don't know if you had a well defined
Yeah.
understanding of that growing up in the US.
Let me start with just, as a Vietnamese American, I grew up white, right? I identified as white because that was our survival mechanism, assimilation, right? So we came here in 1980, and at that time there was very little support structure. So in order to survive, you assimilate, you blend in, you throw away all of your heritage, right? You literally change your name, right? So I have an American name, and that is legally changed. So I had a birth name, and then it was legally changed to an American name. And I think as I kind of become more aware of who I am and what I've become and what I've been, I'm starting to realize, I was a child of refugees. My parents, I looked at the map. They left Vietnam in 1979 in a riverboat out into the open sea. And so I heard these stories growing up, but it's really hard to understand what this really means. And so I looked it up in Google Maps. It's a 20-hour flight, right, with a small plane or a little trip. It's like a 10-hour flight probably. It's a very long journey. And they did that on a boat out in the open sea, in a riverboat that was not designed for the open sea. And so hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people died on that trip, right? They're now at the bottom of the sea because just it wasn't designed to do that. And miraculously, somehow they survived, somehow they got here. But then I realized that moment is an incredibly traumatic experience because not only did my parents leave the war, my dad was a prisoner of war for 3 years after the fall of Saigon. And so now my parents are traumatized. They just got out of the war, incredible poverty, and then made this impossible trip across the ocean. And during that trip, my mom was pregnant with me, so I was an unborn child of that trip. And so part of my journey is just discovering, why am I having all this anxiety, all this trauma? Like my life is good. You started with this conversation. My life is good. Up until about 2 years ago, I thought my life was good until I realized, why am I carrying so much anxiety? Why does like a little knock on the door give me so much fear? Or that I can't leave my door unlocked. I can't leave my car unlocked, right? I'm always trying to possess and hold everything together. And I'm on this rat race. And that led to kind of unpacking this journey and figuring out why am I the way I am? And the more I unpacked that, it just created all these amazing rich stories and just this amazing experience.
Did you always feel this way, or did it sort of come into it became like a dominating force later on that you became very aware of inside yourself? Did you always feel anxious?
Yes.
There's something, a sense of reckoning, or
The physical symptoms manifested itself around when I turned 32. And I think there's a book called Body to Keep Score, right? And that book was all about just traumas held inside the body. And I lived most of my life up to that point really just unaware, right? I was just unaware of it. And now in hindsight, with the new lens I'm looking on, As a child, oh my gosh, I was probably carrying so much anxiety. Like my classmate over here, like if the teacher says stop that, for them to like, okay, whatever. And then for me, it's as if someone pulled a gun and pointed it right in my head, right? So as an 8-year-old child, how do you react to something that you don't even know? Like no one told me that I was carrying this. And so that was my life up until around 32. I manifested some physical symptoms, and it wasn't until around 38 that I started kind of figuring out the source of all this. But
What was it like for your parents? So they left Vietnam, this extremely risky, dangerous sort of journey. They arrived to the U.S. What happened after? So your mom was pregnant with you at the time.
hmm and she gave birth to me in the refugee camp in Indonesia. So I was born there.
Is that where you got the name as a sort of like?
That's right.
Right. Okay.
Yes, got named there. I was born there, and it's a miracle. It's like I'm trying to imagine. Castaway. Tom Hanks is finally coming home, like, and he comes home to a different space, and it's just like they were out in sea for 7 days. I mean, they were robbed by sea pirates, left for dead, and somehow crash landed, came and got picked up and arrived at the refugee camp in Indonesia. So I think my parents, I always have this, my inner child sees them and I put them on a pedestal, right? Like, because they're my parents, like just like all of us. Except now, as a grown adult, I'm looking back and I realize my parents were traumatized, right? And they didn't have the emotion, they didn't have the emotional capacity to raise a child because of what they went through. And so as a grown adult, I'm always asking, I'm always wanting more from my parents. And I realized that they just never had it to give, right? They never had their own physical security to give. And so a lot of what I grew up perceiving that, we're safe, we're happy, we're good, we have all this money, was just a facade to kind of hide that trauma that was hidden in there. Part of the message is to simulate, be white. And then part of my parents is kind of mourning and grieving their home, right? And their culture and their heritage. And so to bring my friends over and, man, the smell of fish sauce, I mean, there's just so much shame in that. Like friends will be like, ew, what's that gross smell, right? And of course now, now we're all hipster and just like a fish sauce is the coolest thing in the world.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's go in. Vietnamese is in, right?
But it's like I'm this child that's living in two worlds, right? Like a world that they left through trauma, and then this other world that we're landing here, and I'm somewhere in between, and I'm just trying to figure out who I am. But I think the survival mechanism is to disregard the past, right? Disregard who I am, where I came from, and just try to latch on, get as close as I can. I think today we call it white adjacency, but we get as close as I can just to survive. Like I guess I realize now, all my actions was really about just surviving.
Mm. So, in what ways do you think you were trying to simulate? Being white can mean lots of things, and although I intuitively understand what you're saying, let's unpack that a little bit. In what ways do you think you were trying to conform? Was it sports, behavior, clothing, all that stuff?
Sports, behavior, clothing, food, right? And going to an Asian restaurant and using a fork because I'm American, right? I'm not going to use chopsticks. And then coming into the workplace, I think adopting white behaviors, right? Competitiveness, perfectionism, just behaviors that today, we might call toxic white culture. But I embraced all of that. I lived it, and I was very competitive. Was cutthroat, always trying to win. Because I realized it was goes back to it's my survival mechanism because I want to be like everyone else. I don't want to stand out. Standing out means you get shot and killed.
Mm. I can relate to a lot of that. I think so. Going back to sort of parents going through their own traumas and having to sort of build up walls and a facade for their kids, or as a coping mechanism. So I'm originally from Bangladesh. I was born there when I was 2. My father was a migrant worker in Saudi Arabia. And my father has an incredible story, actually, and both my mom and dad. He left Bangladesh when he was super young, around, I think he was 27 when he left. But in 1971, there was a war of independence where Bangladesh actually split up from what was, at that time, West Pakistan. So we were East Pakistan. As the British do, they went into a place, colonized that space, and as they left, they fucked everything up, right? That's their legacy, right? So, the whole Indian subcontinent was this one territory, Then sort of the partition happened. You had Muslims move to one side, Hindus move to the other side. And although we're not geographically connected to Pakistan, the British just took a pencil, drew a fucking line, and said like, "Oh, if you're not connected by land, you're still Muslim, so you must belong to the same country." And of course, set it up for another violent revolution. 20 years later, right? So my father was a guerrilla fighter in that revolution, right? As a young soldier, he went in, he was trying to, protect his land, and they're from a very poor agrarian sort of community, no shoes, going to school, that kind of stuff, right? And I think back now, and then my dad somehow left Bangladesh, managed to get onto, like, he worked as a air controller, air traffic controller at an airport, somehow managed to become a marine engineer on a Singaporean ship. And so, actually, going back to your story, he would often share about these finding sort of like refugees stranded in sea that they would pick up on this marine vessel and rescue them. But the point I'm trying to make is that, my dad grew up super poor. My mom, in that civil revolution, her father, my grandfather, who I never saw because he was dead before I was born, was kidnapped, tortured, brought back home. And my mom had to leave, escape her home. She was 17 years old. And so going back to your thing about now, I talked to them, and growing up, I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I wasn't trying to be white per se, but there was a lot of shame, because if you grew up poor, that's one level of shame. Then you come from a poor country with a crappy passport, and you have immigration issues no matter where you go. That's another level of shame. And then sort of like when my dad and mom would talk about, like, hey, just remember to be grateful. And I'm like, nah, what are you talking about? So, you didn't have shoes, so why can't I have fancy shoes? That kind of stuff, right? Because, when you're 16 years old, the whole world revolves around you, right? So
That's right.
But going back to your story, I think, I look back now to my family and I hear them, it's just a whole different interpretation of the past in a way. It's so interesting, right? We're always rewriting our stories. Okay, so I want to jump back to, again, you have, from at least what it seems to me, a very accomplished professional career so fast, and you're doing so many interesting things. But what was that leap into the first being, your career and things like that, strategy consulting, whatever you want to start?
Yeah. I guess I'm not as excited about it because part of my embracing this chubby corn persona is because all of those creds, what you call impressive, I've starting to shed that skin because that it was impressive, right? So I have a degree in economics. I got a master's in public policy, went to Pepperdine. And so highly educated and it went into a career into management consulting. So for about 12 years or so, kind of working with Fortune 500 companies, blah, 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 right? Like I have that spiel down for a long time, walking around, it's like, I'm the shit. This is all the good stuff, right? But
I find it so amazing that so many strategy consultant friends of mine have unplugged from the matrix completely.
oh my gosh, just unplug from it. It's a machine, right? It is this artificial machine that keeps running. And not to downplay it, I mean, it is impressive, right? It's some great stuff, like to come from, the story's great and everything. But
why did you get into strategy consulting? Like, was it because of you felt like that was the right thing to do, career, like that's the way to success? Why did you start that?
I was ladder climbing, right? And part of that ladder climbing is just keep climbing as fast as you can. And the reason I kept climbing as fast as I can was because, one, I was trying to pay off a debt that cannot be paid off. And two, I think it just hides all that trauma that's underneath, right? The faster I run, the more I keep busy, the more I don't have to pay attention to this little noise. And so eventually it does catch up on you. But until then, like I just kept going and going and going, right? What's the fastest way I can get up this ladder? What's that next promotion level can I get? And how do I go up to the more prestigious groups?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you did strategy consulting, and then sort of what was the next leap?
Yeah, so my next leap eventually, this is right around the time when I started experiencing my symptoms. I was trying to figure out, I was having sleep issues, and I was just trying to figure it out. And I said, I need to get off this rat race, was the voice that kept going. And the moment I said that, it took me 5 years before I finally got off of it, because I just avoided it, right? Like, yes, of course I should get off this rat race, but I'm going to keep doing it. And one day I said, okay, this is it. 2020, January 1, 2020. I am going to quit my job. I'm going to go out my own. I'm going to figure it out. and I'm going to give myself a year to figure it out. And then the pandemic, so uh, combine those two together, I think I finally was able to get a lot of time off to just really figure it out.
Well, that feels like the right segue to talk about psychedelics then, because
Yes.
when when did psychedelics become part of your journey? Did you always know about psychedelics? What was your relationship to it before this sort
Yeah.
of like pivotal year?
I would say I spent 2 years in talk therapy. I did EMDR for the trauma related to my parents, and I did another psychomotor. It's like a trauma therapy, I guess, in a group session. And then at one point, I started reading about psychedelics, mushrooms, and I was interested in it.
Did
And I
you
was
did
actually
you
interested in
did you always know that you wanted to get therapy? Because like I think as minorities, I mean people in general are very reluctant to get therapy or talk about mental health. Never mind people of color, but
Yes,
I'm curious. Before we talk about EMDR and so on,
sure.
how did you self-diagnose? Go like, okay, all right, enough of this shit. I gotta do something drastic. I gotta do therapy. Because like
Yeah.
I don't know about you, like my dad, he I think intuitively understands that therapy is important, but as men, especially minorities, it's a completely different thing. They just don't want to hear it. They don't want to go near it.
I think I'm not sure he knows that I'm in therapy. Right? So part of it's like, and every time I start with a new therapist, I have to read their documentation. It's like, how confidential are you keeping this? Right? I don't want this to come out because there's a lot of shame within our Asian culture, right, around mental health, right? You don't talk about it. No one has problems. You just
Man up, right? Just deal with
Man
it.
up.
Yeah, yeah.
just deal with it. I would say I got my sleep issue really started hitting me really hard. I tried every physical thing from drugs to sleep apnea. Western medicine said I was fine, right? I physically am fine. There's no problem with you. You're making it up. And at that point, I said, okay, I've crossed off everything, so it has to be mental. So I started seeing therapists, right, to diagnose the sleep issue. And I went through 5 therapists. And I would say the reason I went through so many is because there is so little research in minorities in mental health space. Very little clinical research. Almost none in kind of refugees like myself, right? Intergenerational trauma. Like, how does this stuff impact you? Like, there's very little clinical research. So it's always just about how do you feel, right? Like, what's challenging you, right? And none of that, like, really pushing it hard. And so I think my journey was in January 1, 2020. When I started my business, I also found another therapist and I said, I'm committing myself to finding the bottom of this hole. I'm going to dig down until I hit rock bottom. And I want you to push as hard as you can. And that's when we really started doing the work. But
When you say dig deep, you mean like going into not only your trauma, but also what is possibly your parents' journeys too.
yes, all of it, all the above. And I was able to get to a point where I'm willing to explore all of it. And that's where the psychedelics came in, right? Like I gotta admit, like when it first came up, I was like, no way, I'm not doing it. I'm not taking drugs.
Who mentioned it? Your therapist or someone else? Something else?
A few. I had a friend that said, "Have you considered this?" And then I brought it up to him, and he did some of it as part of it, and I had just this very strong reaction, right, which was just like, "Don't do it. It's bad."
Right.
And that's my ego speaking, right? And in
Yeah.
hindsight, that was ego
Also
just
conditioning, right?
protecting me.
It's like don't
Conditioning.
do drugs; it'll fry your brain and all that stuff. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I really got interested in I'm looking at indigenous tribes. People are using this stuff for the beginning of time, and there's something that we know. Where I've been so far removed from Earth, because I live in such a modern society now. Like figured I'm gonna go in the opposite direction. I'm gonna go in the spaces where it sounds a little wacky, but I'll give it a try.
Mm. So, okay, tell me about the first experience, or how did you, let's just say, find psychedelics? What was the first substance? Yeah, what was that like?
And I'll keep it somewhat generic because I don't want to disclose the details on it. But essentially, I took a 7-gram dose of psilocybin mushrooms.
Whoa, that is a hero's
Which-
dose.
That's a lot. Yeah, I didn't know what it was. Like I didn't know exactly like what the dosage should be or was, and reading other people's experience. Like, one guy, like I read his book and he said I did 1 milligram, and I did 7. And I'm personally a lightweight, and so alcohol, marijuana, anything that gets in my system is like incredibly potent. And so 7 milligrams for me, like it it hit me immediately the minute it got in my system, and I was out for 6 hours. But just in that experience, I think in that moment, there's 3 experiences in my life that felt exactly the same. One was when I did EMDR, and I really connected with that trauma. Right? It was, for me, that trauma is like a portal into this mysterious universe. And I'm gonna start sounding a little crazier.
Now go full
2 was when
crazy.
I did
That's what this is
deep
for.
tantra meditation. Right? So my neighbor's a tantra embodiment person, and so we did this meditation, and we did the 7 chakras, and I got to this very deep level of mindfulness. I experienced that. That's number 2. And with psychedelics, the third one, when I did the dosage, I mean, that one just took my ego completely away. It was all me going on this ride. And all 3 of those experiences brought me back to the same infinite space. Like time and space are all one. We perceive it normally as like before I just walked around, here's a linear time, and tomorrow I do this, and tomorrow I do this. In that moment, in all 3 of those moments, I experienced like this thing where the past, present, and the future all coexist all at once, and that I realized I have no control of anything. Like all this it just is. Right? And that I 4 weeks later after that event, my takeaway is it is. I don't like using it is what it is. Like for me, like, it is just this very simplistic. The universe just is. And so when I was able to then just accept that I'm just part of this, and all the horrible stuff that happens to me, all the stuff that I do to myself, it just doesn't matter because it just is. And when I let go of that fact that I can't control anything, I actually have more control, in a sense of like I get to just ride this wave. I don't need to fight it. And for the first time, I said, I felt safe. And I broke down crying when I said that for the first time. It's like, it took me 42 years of my life to finally get to the point where I could say, I'm safe, like truly safe. And I'm happy.
That's incredible. Did you do it by yourself? Did you have friends around you? Did you do it in a group setting?
I had support. I had one person that supported me in that journey. And then today I'm on a microdose schedule.
Amazing. Did you at any point fight the experience? I mean, 7 grams, I think it'll just push you straight through the wall. You just break through. There's no reason to fight it because there's no other choice.
I fought it big. I fought it pretty hard though. I mean, like I was scared getting into it because I didn't know what was happening. So I told him, yeah, I'm feeling a little scared. I took it, and then all of a sudden I was like, okay, it's hitting me. And then I had just this this desire to just like throw up, right? And he's like, just calm down, like don't throw it up, right? Keep it in. And I did. I got into bed, and my eyes were closed. I put on headphones for music, and I fought really hard. Just like I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to do this anymore. Like undo, like get off the ride. and colors were everywhere. The music was just pumping, and it was all of a sudden, it was just like I was like, my body felt like I was convulsing, and then all of a sudden, just like and then there was like this moment I can remember where everything just got silent. I forgot what was happening, and that was when my ego let go. Right, that was when I just went for it.
It's so funny. I think putting aside how each of us grew up differently, different life experiences, the ego is. See, I used to think the ego, in the sort of like colloquial sense, all ego is bad. But I think ego is. It's not about bad or good. It's about whether the ego is useful.
Right.
We have too much stimuli around us, and ego gives you a sense of, how to maintain your senses would otherwise go nuts. Right? There's too much going on, so it gives you some form to sort of like navigate the world. Mm-hmm. But ego is a muscle that you have to exercise, right? I think having too restricted a sense of who you are is the problem. And I think with trauma, it gives you an too strong of a structure, a form within which you have to live. The confines are very limiting. Because like once you try to unplug, you're like, oh, ego's like, no, don't fucking let go of me. I'll kill you, So you have to destroy it in some way. So in that perspective, the pushback that you sensed, the fight that you were fighting, what do you think that was? What was that previous sense of you that you were fighting? You think this control? You said you were always wanting to control,
Yeah,
right?
it's my I don't know. It is my ego slash my protector. I don't know what you want to call it. It's my old persona, right? That was just designed to control, designed to kind of conform and create protection. And I think part of this journey for me is just to appreciate it, right? I don't hate it. Like this thing got me to where I am. This thing got me to survive, and I'm alive. I'm successful. All these things I'm grateful for because that protector, that ego kept me safe during this journey. But now I'm old enough, right? Now I am evolved enough. Now I have all my basic needs met. I can tell that ego to you can take a back seat now. You can just sit back. With psychedelics, that just forced the ego to completely go away, right? I had no choice. You had no control on that.
Right.
But in the absence of always being on psychedelics, like, I think now I can just be my true self when I want. Ego can come in and protect me throughout the random days. So when someone gives me the finger in the middle of the road,
Yeah.
keeps me in check.
Yeah.
But also then I'm like, okay, that's good enough. I got this. I'm
Yeah.
in control. I'm driving now.
I think that's
Chubbicorn is
what
driving now.
Chubbicorn is driving. Exactly. I think that's such a good point. I think if you were those of us who are have experienced with psychedelics for quite a while, I think you go through this journey, right? Where in the beginning you're like, all the ego is bad. Then after you experience enough and life continues and you go through your experiences, I think ultimately it's not about bad or good, like I was saying. It's about like having the volume knob. It's like, oh, okay, my ego's trying to take over too much. Dial it back down. Self-awareness, like, being humble, humility is just as important as having an ego and being able to use that as an instrument when you need. But it's not the default, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I find the volume knob is what we want as you grow older, both in age, but hopefully spiritually more wise. It's always a journey, of course, like,
Yeah.
I think in the Western sort of like wellness culture, we glamorize growth. Going back to your point about like, I think even well-being is now commercialized, right? It's capitalized on. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, level up, grow, elevate, rise, ascend. In a lot of ways, like Eastern cultures, it's not about rising. It's about a spiral, right? You sort of like you grow, you break, you die, and you come back. This is what I think
Right.
the sense of rebirth is.
Yes.
Sorry, you were going to say something.
And I want to
Chubbicorn?
interrupt you in that piece because I do, for your audience and this audience, we're talking about minorities. We all come from some background of trauma, right? Because we've had horrific experiences. I have come to appreciate the gift that I've been given. I used to have so much shame around it, right? Like I want to just be a white person that has all these easy paths. Like, why did I get dealt with this shitty card? I've been dealt this gift, right? This trauma, like all the work I've done so far, it is a gift because my volume level is so high, right? Let's say a standard person has 0 to 10. For me, it's like 0 to like 90, right? 90 is like death, right? Like the death. And on a day-to-day basis, no, I don't need the volume that high. So I have the tools to kind of keep it at a 2 or 3, right? Day to day, there's no line in the room. But the beauty is when I'm creating, when I'm making stuff, when I'm meditating, I can dial that volume up. And I'm not just channeling the trauma, but I can channel happiness. I can channel other emotions. I can create stuff at a greater volume. There's something about why is African art so colorful and beautiful, right? Why is like certain art created by our people and so vibrant? Is because our volume is so high. We can tap into that. As a creative, I'm finally appreciating the fact that my volume button can go all the way up, and it doesn't always have to be the bad stuff, right? It's if you can get the bad stuff to turn down, right? If you can turn down the volume of the bad stuff, you can also turn the volume up on the good stuff. And for me, like that spectrum is bigger than for me because of my experiences.
I love that so much. As a creative, as a musician, I think music is the one constant force in my life. I know you have guitars, so you could probably relate to this. in my darkest, deepest, sort of like loneliest times, it was music that sort of like allowed me to go on and have some semblance of like being okay with isolation and loneliness because music was my friend. But there was a time, like, and growing up, like, for me, the grunge era is still my favorite time of music. You're in Seattle, so like, you know exactly what
Yes,
I'm saying. You
absolutely.
know, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, all these guys, and Nirvana especially. I find it very hard to listen to Nirvana now because like I get overwhelmed with emotion. That is, music is so fucking powerful still.
Hmm.
And I used to think there was a time, when I was 16, 17, I sort of, read, Kurt Cobain's biography and his journals, and I used to like idolize him back then. But I think, and I started to realize that I sort of like embrace this thing is like you have to die for your art, you have to suffer. And now going back to what you're saying, I think pain does give birth to this beautiful expression, but you don't have to succumb to it.
No.
And I think that's what I know now that I didn't know before. I'm like, you have to die if you're going to create something. If you're a genius, you have to suffer and you have to vanish. You have to kill yourself. And like with Anthony Bourdain's documentary on 15 Roadrunner, it's like, it was really interesting. The end, and spoiler alert, his friends would say he was always going to go. It's
Mm.
just what was going to happen. But coming
Yeah.
back to what you just said, I think is really incredible. Like one of the most powerful aspects of self-awareness and growth is that you can choose what part of yourself you want to feed, right?
And up till the usage of psychedelics, the only way for me to access that amazing part was to go through the painful portal. And I could see why you go down a dark road, because if that's the only way you access it, you are always going through this painful portal. And when I went through the psychedelic trip, I realized there's infinite number of portals, right? And you don't have to always go back to this painful point in time. It's simply just, all it did was just it would awoken a part of my brain. Now I can access other parts of it. I can, and part of my journey now is to use meditation, use other techniques to access different parts without always going through the painful part, because I don't want, I want to go through some of the good stuff too. Right?
I mean, pain is gonna be there whether you like it or not. It's whether how much like
That's right.
having some sort of, like you said, the word channel. I think that's the perfect word for it. It's like, yes, come in, inspire me, push me to do something, but also don't take over. Like
Yes.
have a seat. Um, I wanna sort of switch gears a little bit, and I want to ask first. You've had this experience, and obviously the work continues in your experimenting with microdosing. Working with microdoses and stuff like that. How has that, like, how do your friends and family see you now? Like, what did they notice since January 2020? And then I think, because this is the way I found you, I would also love people to experience who Chubby Corn is online, that persona. I would love to talk about how your experiences and your sense of self, how does that inform the work that you do, both in Web3, and I do want to spend some time on Web3 because it's really, really important, I think, for me, for you, and I think our audience, like, I think if you're doing psychedelics, Web3 is a natural inclination. Uh, but yeah, let's start with sort of like, okay, since January 2020, how did your family, friends experience who Chubby Corn is?
Let me pick just one individual and go really deep on that one. So my stepdaughter, uh, she's non-binary, so um, they're 13. So at the time, probably 11 when I started my journey. And they actually triggered my journey because there was a day where they had gotten in a fight with my youngest son, and I had a complete meltdown. I mean, like, I went to volume 90, like this was war, death, it was going to happen. And I had an outsized reaction. And I talked to my therapist, and he said, that was a very oversized reaction. There's something deeper, right? So that led me to go down my deep journey. We talked about, trauma and all that stuff. Today, um, they're they're a handful, right? So they're a teenager now, 13, just lots of emotions, very similar to me, just has this very anxious mindset. And I would say, just now as a new parent, I can parent this child without saying anything. Like, just the fact that my central nervous system is calm, like, it just resonates, right? It's just this energy. Like, if they're anxious and they're nervous, I don't need to yell at them. Don't need to say anything. I just simply need to be in their presence. And you can see heart rate go down. You can see them calming down. You can see all those walls melting down because they themselves, right, have this protector, this ego that's coming in and keeping them safe for whatever reason. And rather than trying to solve it verbally, I simply just be in their presence. And I can see my own inner child just, I'm soothing myself, right, while I'm soothing them. And so I think just I'm carrying myself differently. And on the online space, and I think just meeting you and meeting other people, I'm starting to meet many other people. Apparently, I'm just putting out this vibe in the universe, and maybe it's always been there, and I never saw it. And maybe now I have a different lens, or maybe I'm putting a different energy on the world. I don't know exactly, but I'm attracting people like you. I'm attracting other people that are similar to me, and all of a sudden, just I'm surrounded by amazing people.
That's incredible. Vibe is such an interesting word, right? Because it's people. I think I think we generally use the word vibe. I think people get it, like vibe of a party. You go, what's the vibe? What's this event like? But I think there's a certain charisma. I think that shines
Hmm.
through for people who
Yeah.
are who carry a lot of burden. Yes, but it's not everything that they are. There's this like looseness about them. There's this flow, and these are all cliched words now because they get fucking used all the time. But it's really true. It's really true. Like okay, so so your vibe now is your vibe is chubby corn basically,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so what's chubby corn like? If you had to describe chubby corn, if chubby corn showed up to a party, what's chubby corn like?
Chubbicorn is just someone that helps everyone else let down their guard and just be themselves, right? Chubbicorn runs around and says, I love you. And, in my real world, in my work, in my corporate life, if I walked up and said, I love you, either HR will come and arrest me or I'll get some sort of violation. But in
Well,
Web3, I mean, I'm just putting out that vibe. It's just like to
mm,
other dudes, right? And I'm like, I love you. And you could just, people respond back and they're just excited about it. Because I think we all want to be loved, right? Like we all carry such a big shell around us to go through life. And in Web3 and Chubbicorn, I get to just vibe and I get to just bring that energy. And in Web3, I really dislike the term positive and positive vibes and positive things only. Like just it's way too much about positivity. It's not about positivity. It's just about an energy. And how do you bring that authentic energy in a digital space, right? Like where we can't meet physically in person, but I think I'm sending that energy through the keyboard into Twitter, into Discords, and it's working. I mean, I'm attracting some really amazing people.
I agree with you. I think Web three, as and people may or may not understand Web three yet. I don't think we completely recognize what it is. And whether you're in the crypto part of Web3, NFT part of Web3, there's so much hype and bullshit around all of these, and every day we
Yes.
hear something else. But it's about conviction at the end of the day. But I think like this idea about not being positive, not having to be positive, it's not about that. I'm gonna pull up a Kurt Cobain quote really quick because we talked
Nice.
about that. He basically said in his journal something like that, and I'm sure if he was alive and he thought that his wife sold his journals to the public like me, he would have probably shot himself all over again. But anyway, he said this: to be optimistic all the time is not to is to not care about anything. To be pessimistic all the time is to be threatened by everything. So I think really the idea is choosing to be hopeful, not being that by default. And I think it's a lot of performative toxicity about like being optimistic. It's just not the point. It's just saying we don't know, but we have to believe, we have to hope. And so how do we actually spread hope without being cringe about it? You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So coming back to Web3, what is the work that you're doing in Web3? And let's talk about Web3 as a technology, a paradigm shift, let's say. What's your understanding of it? What are you doing right now? And as a person of color and a minority, a child of refugees, why do you think this is important to understand? For many of our viewers are going to be people of color and minorities and people who are not in tech even. So I
Yeah.
would love to hear that from you.
I don't know what Web3 will be. All I know is it's the future, right? We're building the infrastructure for the next version of the internet. And for so long, that has always been built by a small group of people, people with access, people that are calling on their friends to say, hey, come in this space. And so, no shame or no offense to what's happening today in Web3. But it's a very micro niche group of people, right? People with access, people that have the resources to participate, people that have the mental fortitude to participate. And if you're a minority, if you're traumatized, if you are not safe physically, right? You don't have time to participate in this stuff. And so the absence of participating early means we miss out on the opportunity for that creation. So half of wealth that's being created is just simply showing up, right? The people that show up today, the people that are in the space today are going to succeed just by being here, right? You don't even need to put money in today. Just be here. And so I have shared this message with my other minority counterparts is, yeah, the space, you read the headlines, it sounds horrible. It is horrible, but I want you to just show up. And I can't promise that the space will be safe because there is no safe space. But all I know is our people need to be here.
So hype in the sort of social media Web 2 world, everybody uses hype. No matter what political spectrum you're on, what extreme you're on, hype is a weapon, right? It not only attracts scammers, but actually pushes away people because it tells you this is what this is. This is what Web3 is. It's bullshit. This is what NFTs are. Bullshit. Don't go there. Don't go there. All this stuff. And I think it's really damaging. So I think, to your point, it's really important for people of our backgrounds and our communities to have a more realistic, agnostic approach to it. Yes, there's a lot of bad, but to your point, it's so important to participate and shape it. Because the cool thing is, it's so new, you can shape it. If you don't participate, you leave the space that can be colonized by others, bad actors or naive actors or people who are simply ignorant. And we missed that sort of like wave, right? I missed it. Fuck, I grew up in Saudi Arabia, man. If I had proper internet and some mentorship in the 90s, I would have been in a different place. But I found pornography and I'm like, okay, cool. In Saudi Arabia, pornography, great. But I think it's so important what you just said. I really, really believe in that. So, okay.
And the reason
Yeah.
I always say Web3 at the intersection of mental health is for our people, for minorities. Our mental health is the number one thing that we need to work on first, right? Coming into Web3 is you're going to instantly be damaged and it's just horrific and you're going to just get tossed out. If you come into the space in a mentally healthy space, your trauma, your suffering, your missing out on all these things can be the greatest asset, right? For me, being in this space, I'm bringing what I used to perceive as a negativity, and it's now my greatest asset. It's my power. I've reclaimed my power. And so I think I want to spread the message that we all need to heal ourselves physically, mentally, and then we can participate in this. It's Web3 is a technology. That's all it is, right? It's just a piece of tech. So think of it nothing more than just a server or a computer or a chip or whatnot. At the end of the day, what really matters is the human component.
Yes.
And let's make sure we bring the good human component.
I mean, absolutely. We're talking about infrastructure, but people are not infrastructure. You can't optimize humanity. We have a better foundation to amplify. But as with anything human, you can amplify bad or good. So let's choose the good, right?
That's right.
Okay, so what does that look like? In the last sort of like 10 minutes we got left, I think this is a really important point, Chubbicorn. And I think about this a lot, Not only how do I show up, but we have this complete paradigm shift in how we build things. So what is Web3 and mental health? So like Web3, when I say it, so let's just say decentralized ownership of
Hmm.
technological foundations, decentralized ownership in who gets to show up, who gets to participate, who gets to own things, who gets to sort of like build wealth, less gatekeeping. What does that and mental health look like? Like, so when you say people from our community showing up and that intersection, what is that conceptually, theoretically? Like, what are you working on? What are you building?
When I first got into the space, I got caught in the NFT world, and you know, a week in NFT is the equivalent of 6 months in the real world, right? Like
Yeah, it's
it runs
crazy.
24/7, and it's like 100 times faster than the real
Yeah.
world. And so it's like this artificial world, and just so much dopamine gets pumped into you, and you're like, just this is like the Matrix, and it's the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah.
And I've seen so many amazing people, so many
Mm.
wealthy people completely just get ground up, and they come out just like, I'm done. I'm just like mentally destroyed. The reason I promote this is we are not machines. Web3 is a technology and it is a machine. It goes fast. And so, in order to go fast, we have to go slow as humans, right? We have to find our centering, we have to find our grounding, we have to find our energy. And then we can express ourselves in creative ways, not in technological ways, because that's what machines do, right? Let the machines do their machine stuff and let us do our creative expressions. And specifically for the minority community, right? We come from such rich, colorful, vibrant backgrounds. Let's bring that. Let's not worry too much about creating more technology, right? Let's just bring ourselves. But in order to bring ourselves, we have to be able to let go of or let down our guards and bring our true, authentic self into the space. And for so long, for so many people, they're unable to do that, right? You see so much oppression out in the world. You see so much racism and all this horrible stuff. It's just that people can't show up as who they are. And part of the reason why I adopted Chubbicorn is because I want to just be agnostic. Chubbicorn has no gender, has no race, right? It's just agnostic to anything. It's not like I don't care about it, but it's just I want to bring my true self for a brief moment and not have to carry that weight of racism and the weight of sexism and gender and all these intersectionalities. It's too complicated.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is where I think art is so powerful, right? I mean, art well done is actually inherently political, but not
Hmm.
overtly, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't tell you what to think, what boxes to put people in, what, what to think. Where does art fit to your life, in your thesis, in the work you want to do moving forward?
Art is everything for me, and I'll count music as part of it, and and all expressions of creativity.
Mm.
Because as I was climbing up that rat race, as I was running up those ladder and accumulating wealth, and part of my own psychedelic journey is just like, what is the point of all this? Right? I left that experience almost going, there's no point to any of this. That was my initial impression, right? It's like, might as well just end it, right? It's all over. Like, there's no point in this. And as I came down and as I kind of found more grounding, I was like, the point of all this is just to just be and, and be in the present and be more human. The whole point of Web3 is we should be able to use this technology so that we can be more human. The, the path that we're heading today is we're trying to be more like machines, right? We're trying to do things faster. We're trying to work faster, trying to output more things quicker. And in that journey and that seeking of that dopamine, seeking of those metrics and trying to hit all these goals, objectives and valuations and all this stuff, like those are just numbers. And I think at the end of the day, it all comes back to just us being human and just being in the present.
Very well said. Last question for you. Like I mentioned, my hope is that this podcast goes very wide and very deep in many many different communities. You know, regardless of color, gender, creed, backgrounds, it's ultimately about being human, but having more stories be shared. So, what people who've never done psychedelics, particularly again, maybe people from our communities, marginalized minorities, people who may have heard about psychedelics but are scared, afraid, apprehensive, and take a moment if you need to think about it. What would you like them to know?
I think our cultures, if you go back far enough to the indigenous components of our cultures, before your people were colonized, before my people were colonized and war happened, you go back to the people that were closest to the land. And I think this holds true regardless of whether you're a person of color, whether you're white or whatnot. Like, go back far enough, and when the indigenous people that were closest to the land, they were part of it. Psychedelics was just part of it. I think there's a Netflix documentary about psychedelics, right? And then with the first humankind, like the first time they picked it off a piece of poop or something, and there's a little mushroom, we took it, and it helped them connect. And it's magical, right? Everything we need, all the healing that we need exists within ourselves and exists within the ground. And I'm saying this as if I'm some sort of hippie, then I understand all this, like, because I've lived my entire life in packaged goods, right? I live myself with craft singles and homogenized milk, and everything's all processed. My entire life has been processed. And when I did the psychedelics, it was interesting because I on my drive home, I drove by the Jack in the Box that I always go by. And I normally it's my sinful little thing that I love. I went by, I got a bunch of chicken nuggets. I took a bite into it, and I tossed it, and I was like, I'm done. Not because I don't like it. It's just all of a sudden my body was like, oh my gosh, for this little experience, my body got so connected back into the earth. My body was like rejecting all this processed stuff. And now that I'm down, I'm back to eating some junk food again, and it's part of it. But I think the closer you get back into the earth, there really is answers. And it's so wacky and so weird. But I think the more I research into my own family history, you dig back, and my dad's telling me that my grandmother, does this medicine. I don't even know what it is. And then you research it, and you're like, oh, interesting. It's the same stuff that we're tapping now. They know all this stuff. Everything it's already been invented, right? It's just sitting there. It's just we forgot about it. We got so far removed from it.
Amazing way to sort of like come full circle, which is we already know this, we just didn't remember. And I think that really sums up, I think, what I'll say this again, you've lived a good life, you do have a good life. And I think that's what it is about, which is coming back and remembering. And we have to remind ourselves of the things that are inherent, innate, available around us. And it's always work, but it is there. It is there if you want to tap into it, if you can tap into it.
And if you don't mind, I'll end with just, I have a good life. But what it really should be is we have a good life. Like you and I are interconnected. We've always been. All of us have always been interconnected. And somewhere in history, we started segregating. We started becoming individuals. We started using words like I. We are all one. And if the deeper I have dug into the space, the more I realize that we are also interconnected, and that my happiness is dependent on your happiness, that we're all dependent on one another. It's not a journey that I can take by myself anymore, right? I've kind of hit the end of the road as an independent working on myself. At this point, all I'm interested in is doing it in community.
Very well said. Chubbicorn, this was an incredibly inspiring, thoughtful episode. I really enjoyed speaking with you. We covered so much ground, and I resonated with your experience. I admire your ambition, and I wish you all the best in the work that is coming. We're part of the Web3 world, and I really hope we're building something special.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design, Misha Ross on sound design, and Wilson Lin on editing. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. I'm your host, Raj Siraj.